50 Cent just dropped bombshells about Diddy and Justin Bieber that no one saw coming. In the doc, Justin Bieber's name came up when talking about how he worked with Diddy on his song, Moments. But here's the twist. Justin's team immediately released a statement saying he was never a victim. Old videos of young Justin hanging with Diddy are resurfacing everywhere, and people are connecting the dots.
Welcome back to BuzzBuster. Let's start. This is where things start to look especially calculated. 50 Cent has now revealed a Netflix documentary that he claims includes evidence connecting Diddy to Justin Bieber in ways people rarely discuss in public. Just before that project arrives, Usher appears in Forbes and describes Diddy as an important cultural figure who has been unfairly portrayed. Timing like that immediately raises eyebrows. Rather than feeling random, it looks more like a active move. The impression it gives is of someone trying to reinforce the narrative before a much bigger wave of attention crashes in. The documentary carries the title Sean the Reckoning. It is being released through a major streaming platform, and 50 Cent's camp says the film contains material linking Diddy not only to Bieber, but to Usher as well. Against that backdrop, Usher's comments in March 2026 take on a very different tone. When he said his own experience with Diddy did not match the version the public has been seeing, it sounded like more than simple loyalty. It came across as an attempt to shape the conversation early, before outside voices and new allegations could shape it for him.
This might be a bit controversial. I don't have anything negative to say about Sean Combs because my experience was not what the world has seen and how he's been, misrepresented. I put respect on his name.
In moments like this, controlling the first impression can matter almost as much as the facts themselves. 50 Cent clearly noticed the shift immediately. He did not stay quiet and wait for the story to settle. Instead, he responded almost at once. Hours, he was back online, pushing his own interpretation of what Usher's public defense really meant. On March 25th, he posted to Instagram and shared a screenshot of headlines about Usher defending Diddy. From there, he added a caption designed to stir even more reaction. The post suggested Usher was trying to keep people from focusing on what may have happened in the past, while also framing himself as someone who had moved beyond it. It was exactly the kind of message 50 Cent is known for: provocative, cutting, and built to dominate the conversation within minutes. That is what makes this exchange so explosive. On one side, you have Usher stepping into a major business publication and offering a version of Diddy that is more sympathetic than the one currently circulating online. On the other, you have 50 Cent treating that defense not as a sincere personal statement, but as damage control. Those are two completely different readings of the same moment. And once both are out in public, the tension becomes impossible to ignore.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country.
What makes the situation even more intense is the documentary hanging over everything. A Netflix release already brings a huge audience and instant attention. Add in claims that it includes sensitive material involving major names like Usher and Justin Bieber, and suddenly every public comment starts to feel strategic. Every interview, every social post, every carefully chosen word gets examined for what it might be trying to get ahead of. Seen through that lens, Usher's remarks do not land as casual support. They feel timed, they feel deliberate. Whether that was his intention or not, that is how critics are going to read it, especially with 50 Cent watching closely and ready to amplify any angle that fuels suspicion. Now the focus shifts to what Sean the Reckoning actually delivers when it arrives. If it includes what 50 Cent's team has hinted at, then Usher's defense may be remembered as an early attempt to steady the ground before the real fallout began. If not, his comments may look more like a straightforward effort to speak from personal experience.
After being around that man, Sean Puffy Combs, I don't sleep to this day. I have a problem sleeping to this day. Like, yo, man, I'm here to work, man. I ain't sang in a week. I mean, I'm 13 years old, and I'm telling him, look, you're gonna put me in the studio, man.
Either way, the sequence of events has already turned this into something much bigger than a simple celebrity statement. At this point, it is not just about what was said. It is about why it was said right then. Look at that line one more time. It doesn't read like a harmless joke. may be packaged with humor so people will share it, laugh at it, and pass it around, but the message underneath is direct and impossible to miss. What 50 Cent appears to be suggesting is far more pointed than a casual jab. He isn't saying Usher is standing by Diddy out of respect for history, influence, or some broad idea about protecting a reputation. The implication is much darker, that Usher's support comes from fear tied to things that may have happened when he was too young to push back. That is the real weight of the post. Even the laughing emoji doesn't make it lighter. If anything, it adds a layer to it. Instead of taking the edge off, it makes the message feel more deliberate, almost like he knows exactly how serious the accusation sounds and is choosing to deliver it with a smirk. That is what makes the post land so hard. It leaves the impression that 50 Cent either knows something or wants the public to believe he does.
You got Biggie Smalls in there, you got Craig Mack in there. I'm not here to party with you. I don't want to go to the clubs. Matter of fact, I'm too young to even be in here. Why you got me in clubs? We would fight. We would
There is also the timing, and that part matters. The post surfaced during the very same week that Usher's Forbes interview was making headlines. At the exact moment Usher was out in public trying to speak carefully about separating a person's public image from their long-term impact, 50 Cent stepped in and flipped the entire conversation. Suddenly, the focus was no longer on Diddy's legacy. The spotlight shifted to Usher himself. That is where the tension really starts to build. Because if you go back and listen closely to what Usher actually said in Forbes' interview, his words were cautious, measured, and clearly chosen with care. He said he had nothing negative to say about Sean Combs. He explained that his own experience was different from what the public has been seeing, and different from the way the situation has been portrayed more broadly.
This might be a bit controversial. I don't have anything negative to say about Sean Combs because my experience was not what the world has seen and how he's been, misrepresented.
On the surface, that sounds like a personal statement. It sounds like someone saying, I can only speak from what I lived. Yet once 50 Cent's post entered the conversation, those same words started to sound very different to a lot of people. What may have come across as restraint suddenly looked to some like discomfort. What seemed like neutrality began to read more like avoidance. Usher also referred to Diddy as a legacy. That single word carries a lot of weight. Legacy suggests impact, influence, history, and a footprint too large to ignore. It is the kind of word people use when they want to acknowledge significance without getting dragged into every detail surrounding the person. In a calmer news cycle, that phrasing might have passed with little reaction. This was not a calm news cycle. Instead, 50 Cent's message reframed everything. He turned a polished media answer into something people wanted to decode. He made viewers ask whether Usher was defending a public figure out of personal loyalty, strategic caution, or something much more complicated.
Then there's Usher, who spent nearly a year living at Diddy's house when he was young. The way Usher talks about that time has raised eyebrows.
Fair or not, that is the frame he created. And once that frame was out there, every sentence from Usher started being examined for hidden meaning. His effort to stay diplomatic no longer sounded simple, it sounded loaded. That is why the post hit as hard as it did. It just criticized Usher. It challenged the reason behind his silence and pushed the internet to question what was really motivating it. He made it clear that, in his view, Diddy's impact on black business success could not simply be brushed aside. That wasn't an accidental comment. It sounded like a deliberate appeal toward a very specific idea, that the person now serving a 50-month federal prison term tied to transportation for commercial activity should be seen through a different lens because of his broader legacy. At the same time, Diddy's legal team is still pushing the argument that the punishment was excessive. Against that backdrop, Usher's remarks take on even more weight. What he appears to be saying is that the version of Diddy he encountered in private did not match the image the public has come to know through court decisions, federal findings, and years of headlines. That is a striking position to take. It suggests that whatever happened in front of cameras, whatever was presented in court, and whatever investigators were able to establish, Usher believes his personal experience showed him someone else entirely.
I went there to see the lifestyle,
right?
And I saw it, and it was, but I don't know if I could indulge and understand what I was even looking at. It was pretty wild.
Maybe that is how he sees it. Maybe that was genuinely his experience. Still, making that distinction publicly is a high-stakes move, especially when older interviews are still out there for everyone to revisit. Here is where things get complicated fast. Back in 2016, Usher sat down with Howard Stern and spoke about living with Diddy during his teenage years. In that interview, he described witnessing things that he called wild and curious. He did not leave it vague either. He went further and said he had seen and experienced things he would never want his own children around. Those were his words, on the record, in a conversation that remains part of the public archive. That is why this moment feels so loaded. On one hand, Usher now seems to be pointing people toward a more personal, possibly more favorable understanding of Diddy based on what he says he saw behind closed doors.
That's my brother right here from day one. We used to wake up and, pause, but like that's how, back in the days when he was like 10 and I was a little bit older, his older brother, we used to fight over the Frosted Flakes, you know what I'm saying, before pause was invented.
On the other hand, there is already documented footage of him describing that same environment in a way that sounded deeply unsettling. Those two ideas do not sit comfortably next to each other. One version suggests a side of Diddy the public supposedly never got to see. The earlier version paints a picture of an atmosphere so troubling that Usher later said he would keep his own children far away from anything like it. When both statements exist at the same time, naturally people are going to notice the tension. That is the central issue. This is not just about one celebrity defending another. It is about credibility, consistency, and the way past comments can suddenly become impossible to ignore. Archived interviews have a way of resurfacing at the exact moment someone tries to reshape the story. Once that happens, every old quote gets re-examined, every phrase gets replayed, and every contradiction starts to matter. Usher may believe that his private experience revealed a side of Diddy that others never witnessed. He is allowed to say that. Yet the record already shows that he once described those years in terms that raised serious questions. That earlier interview is not rumor, and it is not secondhand. It is Usher speaking for himself, describing a period of his life in words that were hard to misunderstand.
So now, the public is left with two very different portrayals from the same person. One sounds like an attempt to separate the man from the charges in the headlines. The other comes from a past interview where Usher himself seemed to suggest there were boundaries he would never want crossed again. When those statements are placed side by side, the contrast is impossible to miss. Usher once suggested that what he witnessed around Diddy was serious enough that he would never want his own children anywhere near it. Now, in Forbes, he says his personal experience was different from the public narrative and insists there is nothing damaging to share. Those two ideas are hard to reconcile. Either he encountered something that made him draw a firm line for his family, or there truly is nothing troubling to describe. That gap between those positions is exactly where doubt begins to grow.
I moved to New York City, and I lived with Sean Puffy Combs for a year.
That's the crazy thing. Now, that was L.A. Reid's idea, right? We're sending you over to something called Puffy Flavor Camp.
There you go.
They played Usher Confessions. Confessed that Lifetime Achievement Award was a hush payment for your hole and all of the many years of abuse.
50 Cent did not create that uncertainty. He stepped directly into an already uncomfortable question and made sure everyone looked at it. At that point, this stops feeling like a simple celebrity clash. It starts to resemble something much sharper, almost like a carefully aimed instrument designed to force a conversation nobody wanted to have in public. People connected to 50 Cent claim the Netflix documentary includes video material and witness accounts suggesting that Diddy took advantage of Usher when Usher was just 13 years old. 13. That number changes the tone immediately. It takes the story out of the realm of music industry gossip and places it somewhere far more disturbing.
Back then, the business gave that chapter a polished label. They called it part of the culture, part of the image, part of the so-called flavor of the era. The official explanation was simple. Camp LaFace Records sent a teenage Usher to New York to stay with an adult star because they believed the experience would build confidence and prepare him for the industry. That has long been the accepted version of events. On paper, it sounds like mentorship. Framed that way, it appears to be a career move.
a developmental step, a bold but strategic decision made in the name of success. Now consider what happens if this documentary delivers even part of what 50 Cent has been hinting at. It would not take much. Even a small amount of credible testimony or supporting footage could completely shift how people interpret that arrangement. Suddenly, what was once sold as guidance and exposure to the business could be viewed in a very different light. The entire narrative would change. If the film presents evidence, or even a persuasive allegation that Diddy misused that living situation and harmed Usher during that period, then Usher's Forbes comments no longer read as simple loyalty or professional respect. They begin to sound like something else entirely. Instead of a former protege defending a powerful figure from criticism, the public could see a much more painful possibility, a person protecting someone who hurt him. That possibility is what makes this story feel so explosive. The tension is no longer just about who is attacking home in the media. It is about whether years of carefully managed public explanation have covered over something far darker. Once that question enters the room, every old interview, every past quote, and every attempt to smooth over the narrative starts to look different.
And I know, 50, the way you run, this cannot be all that you have. Is there other stuff that you just have not shown? Who's going to be the next docuseries about?
This is why the discussion around the documentary carries so much weight. If it is empty, then it becomes another round of celebrity provocation. If it contains credible material, even in part, then it could reshape how the public understands a major chapter in Usher's early career. More importantly, it could force people to revisit the systems around young artists that were once normalized, excused, or dressed up as part of paying dues. And that is where the real unease sits, not in the feud itself, but in what the feud might uncover. Because if the official story begins to crack, then the silence around it becomes part of the story too. Suddenly, those comments take on a completely different meaning. When he says, "My experience was not what the world has seen," it forces a much bigger question into the spotlight. Is he genuinely describing what happened from his point of view, or is he offering a carefully chosen version of events that protects someone who may still hold influence over him? Once you line up the timeline, the whole situation becomes even more striking. The Forbes interview was published in March of 2026. Not long after that, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals approved an expedited review of Diddy's appeal for April 9. Those dates are incredibly close together, and that timing is hard to ignore. At that hearing, Diddy's attorney, Alexandra Shapiro, is expected to argue that the 50-month sentence he received is excessively harsh compared with the charges tied to his conviction. A judge will then weigh whether he should be allowed out early. That means this was not just any media appearance dropped at a random moment. It arrived just before a major legal turning point.
Viewed through that lens, Usher's remarks land very differently. Right ahead of a critical appeal review, he steps into the public conversation and offers something that sounds a lot like support. He brings attention back to Diddy's legacy. He suggests the public narrative has been distorted. He encourages people to separate the image surrounding Diddy from the person himself. That kind of messaging does not usually happen by chance. It feels deliberate. It feels strategic. Whether intended that way or not, it softens the atmosphere around Diddy at exactly the moment when public perception could matter most. Naturally, that leads to the question people keep circling back to. Did Usher speak up because he truly believes Diddy has been unfairly portrayed? Or was this a calculated effort to influence the mood before a judge makes a decision that could change everything? There is no simple answer, and that uncertainty is what makes the moment so compelling. On the surface, it can be framed as a personal reflection from someone sharing his own experience. Yet underneath that, the context makes every word feel loaded. Timing matters, public statements matter. In high-profile cases, even a few carefully placed comments can shift how people interpret the story.
What happened to Usher? You know, Puff sent this little kid to the hospital. How he sent him to the hospital? Man, Nick was bleeding from the butt. And that's what was said.
I'm mad that people aren't more mad at Usher. Because somewhere along the way, he went from a victim to a procurer to a head turner.
That is why this interview is drawing so much attention. It is not just about what was said. It is about when it was said, who said it, and who may benefit from it. The closer you look, the less it feels like an isolated comment, and the more it starts to resemble a meaningful intervention at a crucial moment.
Maybe Usher was simply telling his truth. Maybe he wanted to push back on a story he believes has become too simplified. Yet, because of the appeal schedule, because of the legal stakes, and because of Diddy's continuing influence, those explanations do not quiet the suspicion. Instead, they raise the stakes. In the end, the real issue is not just whether the statement was honest. It is whether honesty and strategy were working together. That possibility is what makes this so difficult to dismiss. Right before a judge considers Diddy's future, one of the biggest names connected to him enters the conversation and reframes the narrative. Coincidence or not, that is a powerful move. A court is about to determine this man's future, and almost at the same moment, a documentary is set to release that could shake both of their reputations. Those two developments are happening so close together that many people find it impossible to dismiss the timing. What makes this situation even more unsettling is how far the connections appear to reach. If the claims are accurate that Diddy took advantage of Usher during Usher's teenage years, and Usher is now publicly standing by him, that alone creates a deeply complicated picture. It raises questions about loyalty, influence, and the lasting impact powerful relationships can have over time. Yet the story does not stop there. Another name enters the conversation, and that is where the entire situation becomes even harder to process. Justin Bieber is now part of the wider discussion. For weeks, 50 Cent's team has reportedly suggested that the documentary includes material involving both Diddy and Bieber. That detail carries weight for one major reason. Usher was the person who first recognized Bieber's potential. Back when Bieber was only 13, Usher came across him on YouTube. He saw something special early, long before much of the industry fully understood what was coming. A competitive effort followed over who would sign the young singer, and Usher ultimately came out ahead of Justin Timberlake in that race. From there, he helped bring Bieber to Atlanta, took on a mentoring role, and guided him into the music business.
Those facts are already well known. What changes everything is how they look if the allegations now being discussed turn out to be true. If Diddy also had an inappropriate or harmful connection to Bieber, then Usher's position in this story becomes far more difficult to define. At that point, he is no longer seen only as someone who may have endured troubling experiences in his own youth. Instead, a much darker possibility enters the frame. It starts to look less like the story of a person who survived a damaging system and more like the story of someone who may have brought a young artist into the same environment that allegedly affected him years earlier. That is the part people cannot stop focusing on. It transforms the issue from a private bond between two famous men into a larger pattern that feels far more disturbing. Suddenly, this is not just about one documentary or one courtroom decision. The conversation becomes about influence being passed down, about access to vulnerable young talent, and about whether cycles inside the entertainment world can quietly repeat themselves across generations. Once Bieber's name is placed in that chain, the entire narrative takes on a different scale.
Well, I just wanted to be a good example, and it was hard for me being that young and being in the industry and not knowing where to turn, and everyone, telling me they love me and, just turn their back on you in a second.
What seemed at first like a scandal centered on two figures now feels much broader. The concern is no longer limited to what may have happened in the past between Diddy and Usher. The real shock comes from the possibility that the same orbit may have touched another teenager who was just entering the spotlight. That possibility is what gives this story its real weight. Because if that connection is ever proven, the fallout would be enormous. It would force people to rethink not only who was harmed, but who opened the door, who looked the other way, and who helped maintain the system. That is why this story has become bigger than two celebrities and a film release. It is about a chain of relationships that, if the claims hold up, could change how the public sees all of them.
That's the detail that makes people stop and ask harder questions. What did Usher actually know? What did he witness? And what did he allow to unfold around him? Right when those questions start to build, a fresh incident surfaces and gives the story a whole new layer. Suddenly, this doesn't feel like old history anymore. It feels active, unsettled, like pieces are shifting in public view. On March 15th,
TMZ reported that Usher and Justin Bieber had a tense confrontation at the Oscars afterparty hosted by Beyonce and Jay-Z at the Chateau Marmont. Even the descriptions of what happened were all over the place, which only added more intrigue. One account claimed the moment became physical. Another insisted there was no physical contact at all, saying the exchange was simply heated and emotional. Yet a separate report described Usher as approaching Bieber with visible frustration and strong energy. Those versions do not line up neatly. The details clash. The reporting sounds messy. Still, the bigger takeaway is hard to ignore. The story existed in the first place, and it spread because multiple people were clearly talking about tension between them. That matters. A random rumor can come and go in Hollywood without leaving much behind. This was different. The idea that a mentor and his former teenage star protege were locked in an intense moment at one of the most exclusive parties of the year immediately caught attention. It raised eyebrows not just because of who was involved, but because of the timing. When public scrutiny is already rising, even a brief confrontation can take on a much larger meaning.
Not long after that, another piece was added. Within days, Dabrat appeared on the Ricky Smiley Morning Show and said she had spoken directly with Usher. According to her, Usher described the entire situation as an overblown version of a conversation. In other words, from his side, what people were turning into a dramatic clash was nothing more than something ordinary that got exaggerated once it hit the media cycle. Now the picture gets even murkier. On one side, you have conflicting reports about what happened at the party. On the other, you have a denial coming from Usher's side through someone who says she spoke with him directly. Sitting in the middle is the image that refuses to go away. Usher and Bieber in the same room in a setting filled with cameras, witnesses, and industry power, with enough tension for a major entertainment outlet to publish the story. That alone would normally be filed away as odd celebrity drama. A strange little headline. The kind of thing people talk about for a day and then forget. Except this does not land in a vacuum. Placed next to everything else already unfolding, the moment starts to feel less like harmless gossip and more like a signal. Not proof by itself, but a clue. Not a conclusion, but something that makes people look back and reevaluate the relationships, the timeline, and the silence around it all. Because when separate incidents begin to point in the same direction, even loosely, people stop seeing them as isolated. They start connecting them. The party report, the conflicting witness descriptions, the public denial, the timing, the history between both men. Together, it creates a much more loaded picture than any single detail would on its own. That is why this doesn't read like a minor footnote anymore. It starts to resemble a warning sign, a crack in the surface, a public glimpse of tension that may have been building long before anyone outside that world was paying attention.
And once that possibility enters the conversation, everything around it starts to look different. Justin Bieber's decision to pass on Usher's invitation to join the 2024 Super Bowl halftime show sent a message all by itself. It suggested he may no longer be interested in acting like the past never happened.
So Usher was the lead performer at the halftime show for Super Bowl 58, and people were surprised that Justin Bieber did not join him. Now, people really thought that Justin Bieber would be joining Usher, especially considering the fact that he could be seen pulling up to the game with his wife, Hailey Bieber. But after the show finished and no Justin Bieber, people were left disappointed. And we just found out why Justin was in the stands and not the stage. Now, it turns out that although Usher was trying to persuade him to join, Justin was just not feeling it. He hasn't made a statement on social media, so this is all we know for now.
Now look at how 50 Cent handled the moment, because his timing was impossible to ignore. On March 21, days before the Forbes interview became widely known, he uploaded an AI-made image showing Usher and Bieber in a heated confrontation. The post immediately caught attention, but it was the caption that really fueled the reaction. He wrote, "I was a baby. Why you let him do that to me?" Those words were presented as if Bieber himself were speaking. In other words, 50 Cent was creating a scene where the younger star finally challenges the person many believe introduced him to an environment far too intense for someone so young. It wasn't subtle. It was pointed, dramatic, and designed to hit a nerve. What made that caption spread so quickly was how closely it matched the kind of speculation people have repeated for years in private. "Why you let him do that to me?" carries a much bigger implication than a random jab online. The suggestion isn't only that Diddy may have crossed lines. The darker idea people attach to it is that Usher was aware,
that he was present, and that he stood in a position of influence when Bieber was still a child entering the industry. That is why the post landed the way it did. 50 Cent didn't make a long speech. He didn't need to. With one AI image and a few loaded words, he framed the entire situation like a buried truth had briefly slipped into public view. It felt less like a joke and more like an accusation disguised as internet commentary.
The image itself mattered, but the caption did the heavy lifting. It gave the post a tone of something personal, almost like a statement that was never meant to be said out loud. That's what made it feel so explosive. It read like a private reckoning turned public in front of millions of people. And once that was out there, it changed how people looked at everything else. Because now, when you line up the pieces, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. You have Usher in 2016 openly saying he witnessed things he would never want his own children around. That alone is a powerful statement. It suggests he saw enough to draw a clear line between that world and what he would consider safe for his family. Then you have this newer wave of public reaction, where old interviews, old decisions, and old relationships are being re-examined through a completely different lens. Moments that may have once seemed harmless now carry a much heavier tone. That is what makes the situation so unsettling to many observers. It's not just one quote, it's not just one post, it's the way multiple moments seem to connect once people start placing them side by side. Bieber refusing the Super Bowl appearance, 50 Cent posting that image before the interview gained broader attention, Usher's own past comments about seeing things he would never let his children hear. Taken separately, each moment raises questions. Put together, they create a narrative that people are finding very difficult to ignore. And that's where the real tension is building. Because if those pieces do connect, then the conversation stops being about celebrity gossip and starts becoming about who knew what, who stayed silent, and who may have helped open the door in the first place. That is the accusation hanging over all of this. Not a direct confession, not a proven conclusion, but a suspicion that keeps gaining momentum every time another old clip or post resurfaces.
So when people revisit that AI image now, they are not just seeing a provocative meme, they are seeing 50 Cent push a narrative into the spotlight in a way that felt deliberate, calculated, and impossible to brush aside. And once that idea was planted, it became much harder for anyone involved to pretend the public wasn't already putting the pieces together. So now look at what's on the table. We have Usher in 2016 saying he witnessed things he would never let his children be around. We have Usher in 2026. Claims are now surfacing that Diddy has been portrayed unfairly. At the same time, 50 Cent is pushing a documentary he says will present evidence tied to allegations that Diddy took advantage of situations involving Usher and Justin Bieber. That alone would have kept the story in the spotlight, but several new developments have made it even bigger. First, there was an accelerated appeal hearing set for April 9th, a move that could potentially reduce Diddy's sentence. That date suddenly matters a lot more because it suggests this legal fight may shift faster than many expected. On top of that, reports emerged about a confrontation involving Usher and Bieber. Usher's team pushed back on how traumatic those reports sounded, calling them overstated. Yet notably, they did not say the incident never happened.
Well, I'm outside the federal court building here in New York City, where P. Diddy has just been sentenced to 50 months in prison. So that's 4 years and 2 months in prison. He'll also have to serve 5 years of supervised release and pay a fine of $500,000. And that's related to his prostitution-related offences that he was found guilty of at trial a couple of months ago.
Even with all of that, the biggest mood shift came from 50 Cent. Instead of keeping the focus only on headlines and speculation, he made a move that changed the conversation completely. He gave $500,000 in proceeds from the documentary to 6 domestic violence and human trafficking nonprofits in Louisiana. The organizations named were Gingerbread House, the Fountains Community Development Corporation, Families Helping Families, the L Foundation, Moms on a Mission, and Best 13.
Those are not vague promises or symbolic gestures. These are actual organizations, and that is a substantial amount of money. Suddenly, the documentary was no longer just being talked about as entertainment or celebrity fallout. It was being connected to a public statement and a financial contribution that gave the project a very different tone. In that statement, 50 Cent made his position clear. He said viewers would see a lot of energy coming from the documentary. He also argued that celebrity culture has stayed silent about issues that, in his view, have existed for a very long time. According to him, many people are intimidated by those who hold power and success. Then he drew a line between himself and that world, saying he has success without any of those things attached to it. His closing point was blunt. He does not care. That final remark is what really lands. It is short, cold, and impossible to miss. More than anything else, it sends the message that he is not worried about the pressure, the backlash, or the names involved. Whether people agree with him or not, that kind of confidence changes how this entire situation feels. From there, the bigger picture becomes even more interesting. If you are 50 Cent right now, you are not operating from a weak position. He also has a $100 million partnership with Planet Hollywood to launch PH Live. That means he is speaking from a place of major business leverage, media attention, and financial stability. In other words, this is not someone making noise because he needs the spotlight. He already has it. That is why this moment stands out. On one side, you have legal questions, public image battles, and long-running rumors swirling around major celebrities. On the other, you have a powerful rival stepping in with a documentary, a massive donation, and a message that sounds like a direct challenge to an entire culture of silence.
Taken together, these details create a very different atmosphere around the story. It is no longer just about one person defending a reputation or one producer stirring controversy. Now it feels like a collision between celebrity power, public accountability, and a media project designed to hit at exactly the moment attention is at its highest. Picture the pressure building in Times Square, with a production hub in Louisiana and a Netflix documentary set to arrive no matter who tries to block it. There is a sense that this story is moving forward on its own. At that point, tearing everything open might not feel risky at all because there may be very little left to protect. Usher stands in a very different position. His entire career is on the line. 3 decades of influence, respect, and carefully built reputation are tied to the version of events people have believed for years. His standing in music, the relationships that shaped his rise, and the personal history behind his success all matter here. Now that history appears to rest on a conflict that may soon be challenged in a very public way by a documentary that seems impossible to stop. What makes this even more striking is the reaction from the industry, or rather, the lack of one. The quiet has become impossible to ignore. Few people are stepping forward to defend Diddy. Just as notably, almost no one is lining up to reinforce Usher's account either. That absence says a lot. A difficult question remains hanging in the air. How does someone who once suggested he witnessed things he would never want his own children exposed to, later describe that same person as someone the public simply misunderstood? Those two positions do not fit together easily. The contradiction has not gone away, and no one with real influence seems eager to clear it up.
Meanwhile, the timeline keeps moving. The documentary is still on the way. The April 9th appeal hearing is still scheduled. Nothing has been paused, and nothing about this feels settled. Instead, it feels like the moment before impact, when everyone can sense that something major is about to be tested. For now, all anyone can do is wait. Still, this is not the kind of waiting that feels calm or routine. There is too much tension, too many unanswered questions, and too much at stake. The closer this gets to actual evidence, the harder it becomes to believe the current version of events will hold together. That is why the silence feels so revealing. When a story is strong, people usually rally around it. Here, they are holding back. No full-throated defense, no clear explanation, no united front, just distance, hesitation, and a growing sense that everyone knows this situation could shift very quickly. If that documentary delivers what many expect, then the real test begins. Not just for one person, but for every version of the story that has been repeated until now.
This is how 50 Cent acquired the footage for the Diddy documentary. He gained access to a large archive of videos Diddy had been filming for his own private documentary, including behind-the-scenes moments in daily life leading up to his 2024 arrest. Diddy never fully paid for or cleared the footage, so 50 paid and legally obtained the rights to use it.
Reputations can survive rumors. They can even survive controversy. What becomes much harder to survive is evidence. And that is the part making this impossible to ignore. The feud is loud, the headlines are messy, and speculation is everywhere. But beneath all of it is one simple reality. This story has reached a point where public statements may no longer be enough. Once records, testimony, and documented details start speaking for themselves, every contradiction gets harder to explain away. So the calendar matters, the documentary matters, the appeal hearing matters.
each one pushes this closer to a moment of reckoning. Until then, the tension only grows because this no longer feels like a dispute that can be managed with silence. It feels like something heading straight toward a serious credibility test, and not everyone involved looks ready for what happens next.
Everything shifted once Section 1 ended. That part exposed the injury. What comes next is the fallout, the details that start spilling once the surface is broken. When you begin digging into a story with this much history behind it, you almost never find a single person standing alone. Instead, what starts to appear is the system around them, the relationships, the access, the shared spaces that connected people for years behind the scenes. If this began and ended with Diddy and Usher, it would already be troubling. Still, it would feel limited, like something you could isolate to a specific relationship or moment in time. That is not what this looks like anymore. Each time you go back and examine who crossed paths with whom, who spent time in the same circles, and who had regular contact with the same young artists, a larger pattern begins to take shape. Suddenly, it stops feeling like one story about one figure. It starts looking more like an entire structure that allowed certain dynamics to keep repeating. That is where another name keeps coming back into view, Russell Simmons. His name does not just appear through rumors or secondhand retellings. What makes it stand out is that some of the most revealing material came directly from Simmons himself. If you revisit older posts now, with everything else in mind, they land very differently. Years ago, Simmons shared a message on his own Instagram that has drawn new attention. In that post, he described waking up during a difficult period in his life and seeing Usher sitting beside his bed. He wrote, "When I was at my lowest point in my life, I woke up and this man was sitting by my bed." That is the line people keep circling back to.
On its own, it may read like a personal memory, a moment of support, a reflection on loyalty during a hard time. Yet in the context of everything else, viewers and readers are not skimming past it anymore. They are stopping, rereading, asking why that memory was shared that way and what it says about how close these relationships really were. Simmons went on to say that he had known Usher since Usher was a child. That detail matters. It adds timeline, depth, and a sense of how long these connections may have stretched. Once that piece is in place, people naturally begin looking at the broader web around it. Not just who knew each other, but when they knew each other, how often they were together, and what environments those relationships were formed in. That is why this no longer feels like a story you can box up neatly. The deeper you go, the less it looks like isolated contact between a few celebrities. It begins to resemble a culture of proximity, influence, and long-standing access, one where multiple major figures occupied the same orbit for years. Old photos, old interviews, old social media captions, everything starts to take on a different tone when viewed through that lens. Things that may have once seemed casual or harmless suddenly invite more scrutiny, not because a single post proves everything, but because each piece adds to a larger picture that is becoming harder to ignore. And that is what changes the pressure. Once more names enter the frame, the story expands. The spotlight widens. The public stops asking only what happened between two people and starts asking who else was nearby, who had visibility, and who may have been part of the same world for far longer than most realized.
Russell Simmons keeps surfacing for that reason, not necessarily because one post answers every question, but because it pushes people to revisit the past with sharper attention. A statement shared years ago now sounds different. A memory once presented as meaningful now feels like a clue. And in stories like this, clues are what turn private history into a much bigger conversation. What Russell Simmons shared with the public was a polished, harmless-sounding story about spiritual practice and personal growth. In his version, the moment was framed as two people connecting through yoga, reflection, and a search for deeper meaning. It wasn't presented as rumor. It wasn't passed along through gossip. Those were his own words, written by him and posted for everyone to see. Back then, almost nobody stopped to question it. Most people likely read it as one of those celebrity stories about wellness, enlightenment, and unusual friendships formed in elite circles. On the surface, it sounded easy to dismiss. Just yoga, just spirituality, just two people supposedly finding shared interests. Now, though, the context feels very different. With reports that 50 Cent's documentary includes footage involving Simmons and Usher together, that old post suddenly carries a much heavier tone. What once might have sounded like an innocent reflection no longer lands that way for many people. Today, it comes across less like a peaceful anecdote and more like a revealing statement that was hiding in plain sight. That is what makes it so striking. This wasn't a claim created by critics years later. Nobody had to reconstruct it from fragments or rely on secondhand accounts. Simmons placed the story into public view himself. He opened that door on his own, without realizing how differently people might interpret it once the broader conversation around the entertainment industry began to shift. Take a second and focus on the detail that stands out most. He said he woke up and found a teenager near his bed. Not somewhere else in the house, not across the hall, not in another room waiting to talk. According to his own description, the teenager was by his bed while he was asleep. That specific image changes everything, because no matter how softly the rest of the story is packaged, that part is impossible to ignore. Then came the explanation. They had been connecting through yoga. Viewed in isolation, maybe that once sounded unusual but not alarming enough to trigger wider scrutiny. For years, that detail remained out in the open. It was visible, accessible, and attached directly to Simmons' own account. Yet it never truly exploded into a major issue at the time, largely because the public was not examining powerful figures in entertainment with the same level of suspicion and attention that exists now. The atmosphere has changed since then. People are no longer reading these stories with the same assumptions they once did. The lens is different. The questions are sharper. Situations that may have previously been brushed aside as eccentric, spiritual, or simply part of celebrity culture are now being revisited with far more seriousness. That is why this old post suddenly feels so loaded. A statement that may once have blended into the background now stands out for all the wrong reasons. It reads less like a thoughtful memory and more like an accidental admission of something people would inevitably circle back to. In hindsight, it looks like the kind of post that seemed safe when it was written, but became far more significant once public awareness shifted. And that leads to the question many people are now asking, the same question Simmons likely never expected to face when he shared the story in the first place. Why was a teenager in your bedroom while you were asleep? That question is simple, direct, and difficult to sidestep. The reason it carries so much weight today is because it comes straight from the details he chose to share himself. No one had to invent the scene. No one had to exaggerate it. The words were already there, waiting for a different moment, a different climate, and a different level of public scrutiny to give them new meaning. Picture this for a second. You fall asleep, wake up, and there is a teenager next to your bed. In what world does that sound ordinary? More importantly, what was happening before that moment that made it feel acceptable enough to say out loud? That is exactly why people started paying closer attention. Around the same time that post came back into circulation, an old beach photo of Simmons and Usher started making the rounds too. By itself, it would not necessarily mean anything. Two people standing together in a picture is usually just that, a picture, nothing more. Yet this time, the reaction was different. The conversation did not stay at the surface. Instead, people began focusing on the details. They looked at body language. They examined how they were standing. They paid attention to the kind of things most people would normally ignore in a casual snapshot. That shift did not happen randomly. It happened because Simmons' own statement changed the way people viewed everything around it.
Thursday, I was completely wrong, wasn't I? I had the dates wrong all this time. Diddy, come on out.
Once someone says they woke up to find a teenager near their bed, the entire context changes. Suddenly, every old image, every old story, every old memory gets re-examined through a different lens. At that point, people are not just gossiping for the sake of it. They are trying to understand the environment behind the story. They want to know what led up to that moment, what kind of situation made it possible, and why it seemed normal to the people involved. That is where the questions really start. Because if Simmons was present in those same spaces, if he had that level of access, and if he was moving through the same industry circles around the same young talent, then the situation Usher entered as a teenager starts to look much bigger than a one-on-one arrangement. It stops looking like a single unusual experience and starts to resemble a pattern. That is the uncomfortable part. When you step back and look at the wider picture, it suggests that what surrounded Usher at that age may have been part of a larger environment, one built on proximity, influence, and unchecked access. Not one person, not one isolated setup, a system. And that is what makes this so hard to dismiss. Usher was sent by LaFace Records to live with Diddy when he was 13. That much is already part of the record. Simmons was also around that world. He was in that orbit, moving through the same rooms and connected to the same scene. So when people connect those dots now, they are not doing it in a vacuum. They're looking at overlapping relationships, shared access, and the kind of closeness that raises bigger questions about how that entire environment operated. Once that frame is in place, the beach photo no longer gets viewed as a random celebrity image from years ago. It becomes one more piece of a larger puzzle people are trying to understand. Fair or unfair, that is what happens when old comments resurface and cast new light on old moments. At the center of all this is one simple fact: words matter. A single comment can reshape how people interpret everything that came before it. A photo that once looked harmless suddenly feels charged. A story that might have passed quietly now sounds completely different. The smallest details become impossible to ignore.
That is why this conversation has not gone away. It is no longer about one image or one remark. It is about what those pieces might reveal when placed next to each other. And once people begin to believe they are looking at a system rather than a coincidence, they stop asking whether something felt strange and start asking how much more was happening in plain sight. Years after those early stories first surfaced, Usher appeared in Forbes describing Diddy as a lasting icon. At nearly the same time, Simmons was sharing a very different memory about waking up and seeing him standing beside the bed. Those two moments do not cancel each other out, and they do not reflect one person being inconsistent. Instead, they point to something much bigger, a repeated thread running through the accounts of several different people over many years. What makes that especially striking is how long this has been sitting in plain sight. The signs were there, but for a long time, hardly anyone seemed interested in connecting them. Now that has changed. The attention is back, and this time people are examining the full picture instead of brushing past it. That shift becomes even more important when you look at what was happening in the present. During the very same week that headlines were exploding and public scrutiny was intensifying, 50 Cent made a move that completely changed the conversation around him. Without a lot of noise, he revealed a $100 million partnership with Planet Hollywood to launch PH Live in Times Square. This was not gossip, speculation, or an unnamed industry whisper. It was a formal agreement. The deal was made with Robert Earl, a major force in hospitality and the businessman behind a global empire in that space. That kind of partnership does more than generate headlines. It places 50 Cent in a different league entirely.
At that point, his message carries a different weight. When he says he reached success without relying on any of those elements, it no longer sounds like performance or branding. It sounds like someone pointing to visible proof. He is not speaking from ambition alone. He is speaking from position. Look at what is already in front of him. He now has a Times Square venue tied to his name, one of the most visible and commercially powerful locations in the world. He also has a production hub in Louisiana, giving him a serious foothold in another major part of the entertainment business. On top of that, he has a Netflix documentary that is already sold, which means the distribution is secured and the machine is already in motion. Taken together, those pieces matter because they change his level of independence. A person in that position is no longer speaking from vulnerability. He is not trying to break in. He is not trying to keep a shaky seat at the table. He is built enough outside the old system that he does not need to move carefully just to preserve access. Now compare that with what happened to Diddy. The contrast is hard to ignore. The moment the conviction arrived, the structure around him seemed to give way almost immediately. Brand relationships started disappearing. Business agreements fell apart. Doors that once appeared wide open began closing fast. That is what makes this current moment feel so different from the past. On one side, you have someone whose power base appears to have unraveled the second legal consequences became real. On the other, you have 50 Cent standing in a place of visible leverage with business, media, and venue deals already locked in. One figure is dealing with collapse in public view. The other is operating from a position that looks unusually secure. And that difference changes how people hear every word. What comes after a collapse can be even more unsettling than the fall itself. Here, one man is standing with a $100 million partnership in one hand and a documentary in the other that has the potential to expose powerful people. This goes far beyond a typical rap feud. What you're really watching is someone who built his success outside the usual machine, now seeing that same machine turn on itself. That is where the tension comes from. At one point, the pressure around all of this felt intense enough to sound almost impossible to ignore. Soon after, another development shifted the conversation in a major way. 50 Cent donated $500,000 from the documentary to 6 domestic violence and assault nonprofits in Louisiana. That detail mattered, and not just because of the amount. He didn't make a vague announcement or leave people guessing where the money went. He listed every organization by name, making the donation easy to check and impossible to wave away as empty publicity. The groups he named were Gingerbread House, the Fountains Community Development Corporation, Families Helping Families, the L Foundation, Moms on a Mission, and Best 13. By putting each name out in public, he turned the gesture into something concrete. It wasn't just a headline, it became a matter of record. His statement added even more weight to the moment. He said, "You'll see a lot of energy coming from the documentary. Celebrity culture didn't say anything about those things that have been going on for a very long time. They are afraid of people who have success. I have success without any of those things involved, so I don't care."
That message cuts straight through the usual criticism. It pushes past the idea that this is only about attention, image, or entertainment. There is a directness in those words that is hard to miss. He wasn't presenting himself as someone carefully trying to protect a polished reputation. He sounded like a person who no longer feels dependent on approval from the same culture he is calling out. That final line is the one that lands hardest. I don't care. Those 3 words change the temperature of everything around this story. They suggest a level of independence that makes people uncomfortable, especially in industries where image management usually comes first. A person worried about staying in everyone's good graces does not talk like that. Someone trying to avoid tension does not make a statement with that kind of force. What makes this moment stand out is the contrast. On one side, there is money, influence, and a business move worth $100 million. On the other, there is a documentary carrying allegations and long-simmering issues that many people, according to his statement, avoided addressing for years. Put those 2 things together, and the story stops feeling like celebrity drama. It starts looking like a clash between independence and a culture that often protects itself until it no longer can. That is why the reaction feels so strong. When a figure like 50 Cent moves without asking for permission, publicly backs his position with money, and frames himself as untouched by the fear that keeps others silent, it creates a different kind of pressure. It suggests he believes he has nothing to lose by saying what he thinks. Whether people agree with him or not, that stance is what gives the moment its edge.
In the end, the donation, the naming of the nonprofits, and the public statement all work together to send one message. This is not being presented as a performance, it is being framed as action. And when someone says, plainly, that they do not care about the backlash, the situation becomes much harder to dismiss. Some people reach a point where the fallout is already built into the price. They've done the math, accepted the damage, and decided they can live with the consequences. Once you're operating with a deal worth $100 million, a Netflix documentary in your corner, and a production hub set up in a state that rewarded you with tax incentives, detachment becomes a luxury. At that level, ignoring the chaos is an option. Letting everything collapse behind you and still stepping away untouched starts to look possible. That's why this situation feels so revealing. There are people in this story who may be able to absorb the public backlash and keep moving without much visible damage. Yet not everyone has that kind of exit available. Now shift your attention to the figures who do not have the freedom to simply disappear from the problem. Diddy is currently in federal custody as he waits for an appeal hearing scheduled for April 9. His attorney, Alexandra Shapiro, is expected to argue that the 50-month sentence handed down was excessive. A judge will decide whether early release is warranted. None of this is rumor, gossip, or internet theory. It's a real hearing listed on the calendar with real stakes attached. That timing is what makes the next move stand out even more. Just before that court date, Usher appeared in Forbes and made a very specific case. He tried to draw a line between Diddy as an individual and the larger image that has surrounded him for years. More than that, he suggested that Diddy's impact on black entrepreneurship should carry greater weight than the conclusions many people believe they have already reached.
Viewed in isolation, that might sound like a thoughtful defense or personal reflection. In context, however, it lands differently. The placement was hard to ignore. The message was carefully chosen. The moment was even more telling. It looked less like a spontaneous comment and more like a deliberate attempt to soften the environment before the court considers what happens next to someone he clearly sees as a mentor.
And I know, 50, the way you run, this cannot be all that you have. Is there other stuff that you just have not shown? Who's going to be the next docuseries about?
Here's where the strategy starts to look exposed. If this was meant to reset the conversation, it doesn't appear to have inspired a broader wave of support. The industry is not rallying behind him. No chorus of major figures has stepped in to reinforce the same argument. No visible line has formed with executives, artists, and longtime allies, all repeating the same defense in public. Instead, there is a noticeable absence, and silence in moments like this can say as much as a statement. That lack of reinforcement matters. When a public figure makes a high-profile effort to change the tone around someone facing a critical legal moment, the usual expectation is that others will join in if there is real confidence behind the message. You would expect coordinated support, carefully timed interviews, maybe even a wider push to reshape how the public frames the story. That doesn't seem to be happening here. As a result, Usher's comments end up carrying more weight precisely because they are not being echoed. Rather than opening the door to a full industry defense, they stand out on their own. That isolation makes the move feel more strategic, more urgent, and perhaps more risky. It also raises a bigger question about what the rest of the business is actually willing to do when the pressure is no longer theoretical and the decision is almost here.
In the end, this is what separates the people who can afford to move on from the people who are still trapped inside the consequences. One side may have enough distance, money, and infrastructure to let the controversy burn out without taking them down. The other side is staring at a courtroom calendar, a judge's decision, and a public narrative that no longer looks easy to control. Right now, almost no one is stepping forward to frame Diddy as some untouchable icon. You also do not see a wave of people claiming the press got him all wrong. That absence says plenty. It stands out. It feels deliberate. If Usher were truly voicing what everyone in that circle believed, the support would be obvious. More voices would be echoing the same point. Instead, that backup never comes. Most people are holding their position, staying on the sidelines and letting him carry that message by himself, while the documentary remains unfinished and the court date moves closer. That same pattern leads straight back to Simmons. He has not made any real effort to publicly defend his own name. There has been no clear explanation for the Instagram post, no attempt to clear up what he meant when he described waking up and seeing Usher near his bed. On top of that, he still has not responded to the claims that footage tied to 50 Cent's team may appear in the documentary. What is left is quiet, not casual quiet either, the kind that makes people pay attention. When influential figures suddenly stop talking, it often suggests they understand that speaking freely could deepen the problem. Every statement becomes a risk. Every explanation can open another door. Because of that, they wait. They study the reaction. They try to read where the situation is heading before making a move. At this point, it looks like several people are doing exactly that. They are watching to find out whether the documentary actually arrives with the material people have been quietly discussing. They are also waiting to see what happens in court and whether Diddy walks away without consequences. Until those answers come, nobody wants to be the person caught saying the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. That may be the clearest part of all. Silence in moments like this is not random. It can be strategic. It can be protective. Sometimes it is the easiest way for powerful people to avoid drawing more attention to themselves while everything around them becomes more uncertain. So while the public keeps looking for statements, pushback, or some coordinated defense, what they are getting instead is distance. Usher appears to be left out front on his own. Simmons remains unresponsive. Others stay in the background, saying little and revealing even less. And that creates an atmosphere that feels impossible to ignore. The less they say, the more noticeable it becomes. The more noticeable it becomes, the more people start asking why. For now, the answer seems simple. They do not want to step into a situation that could turn against them overnight. They would rather stay quiet, let events unfold, and see what comes next before attaching themselves to anything publicly. If the documentary lands, if the rumored footage is included, or if the court outcome changes the conversation, their next moves may shift fast. Until then, silence is serving a purpose. It keeps them at a distance, it limits exposure, and in their minds, it may be the best way to stay outside the fallout. Everything now points to one date, April 9. That is when the appeal goes before the court, and the outcome could shift the entire conversation. Diddy may receive a reduced sentence, or the ruling may leave everything exactly where it stands. Either way, one thing does not change. The documentary is still on the way. No matter what happens in court, the material behind that project does not disappear. The footage remains. The claims tied to it have not gone away. Most importantly, Usher is still positioned right at the center of the public fallout after already aligning himself in a way that is going to be very difficult to distance himself from now. If 50 Cent's documentary reveals even a portion of what he has been teasing, then Usher's Forbes interview may be viewed very differently. What once looked like support could certainly be interpreted as something far more complicated. The tone shifts completely once people begin re-examining old comments through a new lens. On the other hand, if the documentary fails to produce anything substantial, then the spotlight swings back onto 50 Cent. At that point, the project risks looking less like a serious expose and more like a calculated attempt to turn major accusations into attention and promotion. That is what makes this moment so tense. There is no version of this story where every major figure involved escapes without questions. That pressure is exactly what is hanging over the industry right now. You can feel it in the silence. Very few people are speaking, and that quiet does not feel accidental. It feels strategic. Everyone seems to be holding their breath, watching, waiting, and trying to figure out which direction this story is about to go before attaching their name to any opinion. In a situation this loaded, silence says plenty on its own. It suggests that people are not staying quiet because they have nothing to say. They are staying quiet because they understand the risk of saying the wrong thing too early. One misplaced comment, one old photo, one interview pulled from the archive, and suddenly the internet starts asking a completely different set of questions. That is the real fear spreading behind the scenes. Nobody wants to be the next person dragged into the conversation. Nobody wants their past statements revisited and reinterpreted under a harsher spotlight. A post that once looked harmless can take on a very different meaning once the public mood changes. A casual connection from years ago can suddenly become a headline. For artists, executives, and anyone connected to this circle, the danger is not only what is true or false, it is also how quickly perception can turn. Once that shift begins, it becomes incredibly hard to control. That is why this waiting period feels so intense. It is not just about one court date or one documentary release. It is about what those two events could unlock. April 9th is not simply another day on the calendar. It may become the moment that decides how all of this is remembered. The appeal will matter. The documentary will matter. The reactions that follow may matter even more. Until then, the industry remains frozen in that uneasy pause, with everyone hoping they are not the next name pulled into the spotlight. No one wanted to become the next person forced to answer one chilling question. Why was a teenager in that room in the first place? What makes this so unsettling is that the story was never only about Diddy. It did not begin and end with Usher either. The bigger issue points to something far wider. A machine that guided young artists through circles of influential men with wealth, access, and the power to shape what took place out of public view.
For years, that kind of influence helped control the narrative. Doors stayed closed. Questions went unanswered. The people at the center of it all appeared untouchable, protected by status, connections, and an industry culture that kept uncomfortable details buried. Now that protection is starting to crack. Piece by piece, the structure around this story is being dismantled, and the version of events that held for decades is no longer the only one being heard. Pressure is building fast. An appeal hearing is on the way. A documentary is also coming. Those two developments could bring even more attention to the people and systems that once operated without scrutiny. Perhaps the most dramatic shift is this: the individuals who spent years steering the conversation are no longer fully in charge of it. Control is slipping. The silence is weakening. What was once managed behind closed doors is now being examined in public, and that changes everything.